Okay, I think we'll get started now that everybody appears to be in the room. We've got a lot to get through tonight. Welcome to all of you here in another packed house at the Residence Palace in Brussels. And of course, also there are several thousand people watching online, and I suspect that includes some sizable contingents in the US and possibly also Russia. We're joined here tonight for POLITICO Playbook Cocktails with the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, a former Prime Minister of Norway. And you can join the conversation online by tagging your questions or your comments with tag Playbook Cocktails. And obviously, we'll also take questions throughout and at the end of the interview tonight. It's going to be a fun hour in the lead up to the NATO Warsaw Summit. NATO is juggling a lot of balls right now, from threats of renegotiation from Donald Trump to an increasing international engagement from Germany, a somewhat weak France, a possible Brexit, the spreading threat of ISIS, both here in Europe and outside of Europe, and of course, Russian aggression along the eastern borders of the NATO alliance. We're not going to be short of things to talk about. But first, this event couldn't happen without the support of our sponsor, Raytheon. So I'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Christopher Lombardi, who is the Vice President for Business Development at Raytheon International, to say a few words. Chris, come on up.
Ryan, thank you very much for that introduction. As someone who calls Brussels my home, I'm honored to be here. It's very nice to be here. And I know, as Ryan said, the Secretary General is juggling a lot of balls right now, and there's a lot of things on the agenda for the upcoming summit in Warsaw. I would like to address just one of those topics tonight that I think that will be on the summit in Warsaw, and that is the urgent need for more robust, coordinated missile defense across Europe. 67 years ago in Washington, D.C., the founding members of the NATO alliance signed a treaty, and that treaty committed their governments to promote stability and well-being through collective defense in the North Atlantic. And in his visit to that same city this spring, Secretary General Stoltenberg reiterated the alliance's clear purpose of protecting its citizens and territory against any real threat, conventional or ballistic. So what do I mean by ballistic threat? Well, the U.S. Missile Defense Agency recently stated that there are more than 6,000 ballistic missiles outside of U.S., NATO, Chinese, and Russian control. That's not counting the thousands of shorter-range missiles being built by non-state actors across the Middle East and North Africa. There's also the growth of higher-tier, longer-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and even short-range rockets launched from aircraft. Here today, in this room, we're in range of those threats. Given that fact, missile defense now is more than ever an essential part of NATO's role. The need for missile defense reinforces NATO's relevance. Admittedly, this is a threat that's very difficult to even comprehend. If a ballistic missile were launched at a European city right now, we'd have less than 20 minutes to respond, to detect, track, identify, and destroy. NATO's leadership and military commanders know that the best response to this threat is interoperability, systems that work together in a layered approach, systems that combine different types of protection to intercept and eliminate threats coming at varying speeds, altitudes, and distances. Because of European density, no one defensive measure can protect on its own. And because of European geography, no one nation can defend itself without the help of others. True defense here requires an alliance of like-minded countries with a connected missile defense system. NATO's member states must be able to share information, make collective decisions, and take swift action using land or sea-based solutions. Last month, NATO celebrated its first land-based Standard Missile 3 site in Romania becoming operational. The following day, NATO broke ground on the second site in Poland, which is going to become operational in 2018. I'm sure you've heard about this in sound bites and on the news, but just to elaborate a bit, the sites in Romania and Poland take the Standard Missile 3, or the SM-3, which originally was used on ships, and brought them ashore, essentially moving this land-based the sea-based capability to land. And when an SM-3 is launched from a ship or from land, it goes into space and takes out threats high above the Earth's atmosphere in space. And it does this not with an explosive warhead, but by ramming into the threat. Our engineers have likened it to a 10-ton truck traveling at 1,000 kilometers an hour. The sheer impact destroys it completely. This is a real capability that is deployed today, both on land and at sea, protecting Europe. It's an incredible defensive capability, and that's why it's the cornerstone of the US's contribution to Europe's missile defense. But there's also lower tier threats for military installations, cities, critical infrastructure, and 13 countries, including 5 in NATO, are using combat-proven Patriot systems for this lower tier threat. Just last week, Saudi Arabia intercepted a ballistic missile coming from Yemen with their Patriot system. Just last week, Japan ordered its SM-3 naval destroyers and their land-based Patriots to shoot down anything coming out of North Korea. Saudi and Japan are singular nations, but Europe is defending itself through an alliance. And altogether, these defensive systems are real and deployed today in Europe, but what we have in place is not enough to address the growing threat. Each NATO nation must contribute for its own good and for the good of the whole. When interoperability truly exists across countries and platforms, the result will be the kind of robust shield necessary to ensure Europe's safety and security. Many allies are making contributions: Romania, Poland, Spain, Germany, the UK, Netherlands, Denmark, the US, and others. And these contributions are imperative because interoperability and collective defense is more than critical. It's essential. In addition to better security, interoperable systems provide significant cost and efficiency benefits. NATO nations can take advantage of mature training, support structures, and learning from each other's best practices. At a time of new spending pressures, whether because of the refugee crisis or continued austerity measures, countries can achieve considerable cost savings from sharing missiles and components, conducting joint testing exercises, and coordinating on logistics and maintenance. Last month, General Breedlove talked about the arc of instability and aggression threatening our interests and allies in our region. He's correct. The danger of ballistic missiles today is greater because of this instability. The nature of the threat to Europe requires urgent action and smart funding commitments. Spending money on development projects that may never be operational, even after decades of research and development, is a luxury that Europe cannot afford. Similarly, Europe cannot risk its security on untested systems that lack broad international support and could potentially fail when called upon. Instead, Europe needs immediately available, well-connected missile defense systems that can be continually upgraded while maintaining their compatibility with existing technology. That approach will ensure that Europe has a strong, effective network to protect its people across the continent now and for decades to come. Europe's firm commitment to missile defense is indispensable. I am certain it'll be an important topic at the upcoming NATO summit in Warsaw, and having Secretary General Stoltenberg driving this objective is reassuring for all of us in living in Europe. So thank you very much for your time. Ryan, thank you, and I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Well, I'd now like to invite to the stage Mr. Stoltenberg, and we can get underway with the interview.
This is not the kind of chairs we have in NATO.
No. we really keep you on your toes, literally, here. But we'll keep you upright, I promise. So, Mr. Stoltenberg, there's a lot of heavy topics we'll be able to get into, but I wanted to start off a little bit on the personal side to get to understand who you are and what you bring to the table as a person when you're going through all of these tough issues. And I understand that you spent some of your childhood growing up in Belgrade. You had a Yugoslavian nanny, and you've continued the relationship now with holidays and the like. So how did those experiences shape you?
They have shaped me in a way that very much of my identity is about growing up in a country which was not Norway. And I lived in what is now called former Yugoslavia. I lived in Belgrade, and as you said, I lived there for 3 years, but then we moved back to Norway after some years, and then I had a Serbian nanny. And she was very kind to me. She prepared a lot of Serbian food, and I still have a nice and good relationship with Serbia.
Okay. And then one of the ways that many of the people around the world came to know you was the tragic events in 2011, where including dozens of people, some of whom you knew personally, were massacred at that Labour summer camp just outside of Oslo. Was that your toughest day?
Yeah, it was my toughest day ever, as at least in position as a Norwegian politician, and that was partly because it was an attack on the government building where I worked, and several people lost their lives, and also because it was an attack on this island where the young Social Democratic Party of Norway has gathered for decades. I have been there every summer since 1974, so many of my friends and people I know very well, they were there also this summer, and I was actually going to go there the day after. So this was an attack on Norway. 77 innocent people lost their lives, but it was also an attack on something which was very close to me. The office where I worked, and the youth organization which I was leader of during the 1980s, and which was very close to me for many, many years.
And did it change how you view conflict? In a sense, I mean, I'm not saying maybe you were a pacifist as a younger person.
I don't think it changed in the way I view conflict, but it was a very strong reminder of the fact that no country is 100% immune against terrorist attacks. That terrorist attack can hit anyone, and also a country like Norway. And of course, Norway has always regarded itself as a very safe, stable country, and we didn't actually believe that something like that could happen in our country. But it happened in Norway, and we have seen terrorist attacks in many other countries, both before and after. So for me, it was a very, very strong reminder of that we are all vulnerable. But it was also an example of how the Norwegian people were able to react, to stand up in defense of our open societies, our freedom, our democracy, and that's exactly the same we have seen in Paris, in Brussels, that people want to keep on with the life they live and not be intimidated by terrorists. And that was great to see in Norway, and it has been great to see also in many other European countries.
Now, one of the things that we hear a lot about these days is the need for the EU and NATO to work more closely together, to cooperate. And I'll still keep it on the personal track a little bit there, because you knew Federica Mogherini really for decades. You know, a lot of people, when Mogherini was appointed to her current role, it was like, where did she come from? She's come out of nowhere. But she didn't come out of nowhere, and in fact, you've known her for those 20 years. So tell us a bit about that, and tell us something that you know about Federica that we wouldn't know.
No, I promised never to tell. So no. But first of all, I know her as a politician, because we were. So she's from the center left in Italy. I'm from center left in Norway. So we knew each other from political life. She's much younger than I am, so she was a very young girl. No. So, but we worked together in politics, and that's the way I learned to know her. And then we became, let's say, international politicians in Brussels almost at the same time. I became Secretary General of NATO, and she became High Representative, Vice President in the European Union. And since then, we have worked very closely together, and we have both been very engaged in trying to enhance, strengthen the NATO-EU relationship. And I think we have succeeded, at least, to contribute to a new momentum in the EU-NATO relationship. But I can also add that I have some kind of personal relationship to the European Union, because Norway is the only country in the world that has negotiated an accession treaty with the European Union and then voted it down, not only once but twice. And I have been campaigning in favor of yes both times, and so I'm an expert in losing referendums. So if you want to, so I have nothing to, what should I say, to tell David Cameron about winning referendums. He has to do it himself.
Well, I was going to come to the Brexit question a little bit later, but seeing as we're on it, let's go there for a second. Would a Brexit materially affect the security and the capabilities of the NATO alliance?
First, I think it's important for me to underline that it's up to the people of Britain to decide whether they want to remain or leave. Second, even if I wanted to give them advice, I'm not certain that whether that will help. Because
but we can put the advice aside.
Yeah,
how would it affect your work?
What I can say, what will matter for NATO, and that is that I strongly believe that a strong United Kingdom in a strong Europe is good both for the United Kingdom, it's good for Europe, but it's also good for NATO. Because we live in times with new security threats, with instability, and we don't need more instability, we don't need less cooperation in Europe, we need more. And we already see a more fragmented security environment, and therefore everything that binds us together, everything that strengthens the unity, is good for all of us. And especially for NATO, I think it is a great advantage that you have the United Kingdom being a strong advocate inside the European Union, pushing for more cooperation with NATO, transatlantic cooperation. And then you have the United Kingdom inside NATO at the same time pushing for exactly the same. And the United Kingdom is you know, one of the biggest economies in Europe, and it's the largest force contributor in Europe to the NATO alliance. It's no other country in Europe invests more in defense than the United Kingdom. So it's good to have the United Kingdom both inside NATO, pushing for transatlantic cooperation, and inside the European Union pushing for the same, and NATO-EU cooperation. So that's it matters what the United Kingdom does, and therefore a strong United Kingdom pushing for cooperation between NATO and the European Union inside both organizations is good for us.
Yep. And would it be fair to say that the success or the fate of the EU and NATO are more and more intertwined? I think this came up during the Grexit discussions last year, where if there had been a Grexit, not only does that put pressure on the budgets that could otherwise go towards meeting the NATO 2% target, it also gives comfort to the sort of people that NATO is guarding against. You know, I think Russia would have been very happy for a Grexit, for example. So, I mean, is it true to say that NATO and the EU depend on each other more and more to be stabilizing forces?
We depend on each other more and more for several reasons. Partly for just the fact that the enlargement of the European Union and the enlargement of NATO means that most people live in Europe. They are living in a NATO allied country. More than 90% of the population in the European Union live in a NATO country. So we share members, but most of the population in the European Union are protected by the NATO alliance. So in that sense, we depend on each other. But we also depend on each other when we are facing some new security threats and challenges. For instance, hybrid warfare. And hybrid warfare is this mix of military and non-military means of aggression. It's this mix of overt and covert operations. It's threats against infrastructure, against energy supply, the function of the governments, cyber, and so on. And the European Union has some capabilities. NATO has some capabilities in addressing these challenges and these threats. But none of us have all the tools in the toolkit. We have to work together to address these challenges. And therefore, hybrid threats has just made it even more important that NATO and the European Union is able to work together.
And so in that context, you've also gotten a lot better at going to each other's meetings. There seems to be a lot more dialogue between the two institutions now. But given that the EU itself obviously has limited operational capabilities compared to the national governments and militaries. How do you take it beyond words? Have you got some, can you give us some practical examples? Because I think there are a lot of people in this town, in Brussels, who realize NATO is 3 kilometers away, but they don't really know how you work, and they don't really understand how the cooperation happens in practice?
But first of all, I think it's important that we go to each other meetings, because politics is about meeting people, it's about discussing issues, it's about addressing issues and try to understand each other. So for me, it is a great advantage that I'm invited to EU defense ministerial meetings, some foreign ministerial meetings, and also some of the summits. So I appreciate that very much, and especially coming from Norway, because as I told you, I have tried to convince Norway to join the European Union twice and failed. But now I have some kind of personal membership in the European Union, because I'm able to participate in European ministerial meetings. So it's a great personal...
You got there in the end.
Yeah, I got there in the end, but very alone. But I think it is important that we... And Federica Mogherini, she attends our meetings, and the EU presidents, Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk, they will be at our Warsaw summit and so on. So that we meet, that we share opinions, views, analysis is in itself important. Second, we have also been able to make some progress on some concrete areas. During the last months, we have been able to reach an arrangement on cyber, which is a technical arrangement, but it is important because to be able to work more closely on how to address cyber threats and cyber challenges is important, the European Union and NATO. And we have also been able to agree to work together in the Aegean Sea, and we have made an agreement on how to exchange information, how NATO ships, assets can provide information, share information with Frontex and the Greek Coast Guard. And these two agreements or arrangements which we have achieved during the last 3 months is actually more agreements between NATO and the European Union than we have achieved during the last 13 years. Meaning that now we are really making some progress, both when it comes to more political contact, meeting, discussing common challenges, but also when it comes to the very practical cooperation on the ground related to cyber and, for instance, the operation in the Aegean Sea.
Mm-hmm. And is the next stop getting more contributions towards defense? I know that there are several countries now at 2%, but that's really a cause of concern for the US side, for example, isn't it?
Absolutely. The next stop is to make sure that European NATO allies increase defense spending. We are actually starting to see some progress, but we have a very long way to go. Because we made a very firm commitment at our summit in Wales in 2014 to stop the cuts, then gradually increase defense spending, and then aim at 2%. And 2015, the first year after we made the pledge in Wales, we were actually able to stop cuts among European NATO allies. So now we are working on 2016. I hope that we can see more progress. It's a bit too early to tell, but at least the first year after the pledge, we were able to stop cuts, which is the first step towards a gradual increase. And I know that the United States is extremely focused on this, because the GDP of the United States is almost exactly as big as the GDP of NATO, European NATO allies. So we are in one way as rich as the Americans. But they are spending more than twice as much on defense than we are doing, meaning that more than 70% of NATO's total defense spending is coming from the United States. And this is not sustainable, this is not a fair burden sharing, and therefore this is partly about increasing total defense spending, but it's also about having a more equal burden sharing between Europe and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, the EU is proud, or sometimes even likes to brag about how good it is at getting nations to cooperate together. But there's one example where NATO has more experience, and that is having Turkey as a member of NATO. And as Turkey gets drawn more and more into EU politics, as everyone is all involved in the Mediterranean more and more, for example, around migration, have you got any advice or any reflections on what the EU can do to have a more fruitful and harmonious engagement with Turkey?
First of all, I will welcome what the European Union and Turkey has been able to achieve so far. The migrant and the refugee crisis is the It's a profound humanitarian tragedy. It's the biggest migrant and refugee crisis we have seen in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And there is no easy way to address that. But at least it is important that Turkey and the European Union has been able to come to an agreement and to start to address something which is a common challenge. NATO is contributing to that. We have deployed between 6 and 8 ships to the Aegean. They provide information, surveillance, reconnaissance. They share this information with the Greek Coast Guard and with Frontex. And perhaps most importantly, we share this with the Turkish Coast Guard, so they are able then to act upon the information they get from us. And the difference is that when Frontex take action, then they bring the boats to Greece. But when Turkey take action, the boats are brought to Turkey. And I think that the European Union, NATO, have been quite successful in cutting the lines of illegal trafficking and migration in the Aegean Sea. And the most important thing NATO does is not actually to provide concrete information and to be there with ships, but it is that we create a platform for enhanced cooperation between Turkey, a NATO member, but not the EU member, to work together with the European Union, Frontex, and Greece.
Okay, now let's move to Donald Trump.
He's a candidate.
He is a candidate, yes, yes, well observed. He also said that NATO is, quote, obsolete. He says, quote, it is time to renegotiate because, quote, we certainly can't afford to do this anymore. Do those comments worry you?
So I will not comment on the election campaign in the United States, and I will not be part of that election campaign. And what I also can say before I say something about the issue is that I think it is a strength in NATO that we are, actually one of our core values, is that we are open democratic societies. And in open democratic societies, there are different opinions, different views, and we agree and we disagree. That's part of being democratic societies where people have different opinions. But despite of that, we have been able to reach conclusions, to reach consensus, and not only do that, but also implement our decisions. And I'm 100% certain that we will also be able to do that after the US presidential election this autumn. My message is that NATO is important for the security of both the United States and for Europe. I think that 2 world wars have learned or have taught the United States that stability, peace in Europe is also important for the United States. Second, we have to remember that the only time we have invoked Article 5, the collective defense clause of NATO, was in defense of the United States after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And thousands of Europeans and other partner nations have been, for instance, have sent soldiers to Afghanistan. More than 1,000 European soldiers and soldiers from partner nations have lost their lives in Afghanistan in an operation which has been organized in the protection of the United States against global terrorism. So yes, the Europeans should do more. Yes, the Europeans should spend more on defense, but NATO is also important for the security of the United States, and therefore NATO is good for both Europe and the United States.
So Trump effectively does have a point then when he says that America pays or carries too much of the cost burden. Europe needs to up its game.
As we stated at our summit in Wales, 28 heads of state and government from all the 28 NATO allied countries, we agreed that those countries that spend less than 2% should increase.
Yeah. And so it's growing the pie. It's not that the US should pay less, it's that Europe should pay more, and therefore we have a bigger pie.
If the Americans, so as I say, maintain their level of spending and we increase our level, Europeans start to increase their level of spending, then of course the pie will be bigger and it will be more equally shared. So that's in a way part of the defense pledge is to also have a more fair burden sharing between the United States and Europe. Let me underline that in Europe you see many different, how should I say, levels of defense spending. You have countries like the United Kingdom, you have Poland, you have Estonia, you have others, which are spending 2% or more already. So Europe is not one thing. Europe is many different countries with different levels of defense spending. And I welcome, for instance, that the UK made such a strong commitment to maintain about 2%. And Poland, which is a quite big European economy, has been able to reach 2%. But I would like, of course, to see more NATO allies do the same.
What can you do with Germany? I mean, it must be a bit disappointing that Germany is constantly telling the world that it's got an economic model that works. And if Germany, with its size and with its claimed economic success, can't get to 2%, who can?
Well, Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, so therefore it matters what Germany does. Germany has actually decided to increase defense spending. I met with Chancellor Merkel last week, and she very strongly confirmed that Germany has stopped the cuts, and Germany will start to increase defense spending. And we have seen the first increases in German defense spending. We've also seen the first increases in the number of soldiers in the Bundeswehr. So they have, there's a long way to go to 2%. But again, then I think it is important to remember that we decided to not go to 2% immediately. We decided to stop the cuts, gradual increase, and then over a decade reach 2%. And Germany has been able to stop the cuts and start to increase after only 1 year after we made the pledge. So they are on their way. They have started. They have a long way to go, but at least they are moving now in the right direction also in Germany. Add to that Germany is really contributing to our collective defense. They have contributed to the enhanced collective defense in Europe, and they are a key ally, for instance, in Afghanistan, where they are a lead nation in the north. So Germany contributes a lot already.
Turning to the Warsaw Summit now, the critics of NATO would put it out there that NATO is struggling to rejuvenate or find a new role in the world. Other critics, such as Russia, want you to lay off and ease your readiness to defend the members of the alliance. So to what extent is this summit a make or break moment for NATO?
I will not call it a make or break, but I will call it a landmark summit, and I will call it one of the most important summits in the history of NATO, because we are faced with such a fundamentally changed security environment. With a more assertive Russia in the east, which has tripled its defense spending since 2000, which has invested heavily in new and more modern equipment, and which has been willing to use military force against a sovereign nation in Europe, against Ukraine. So that has created a more challenging situation to the east. And then to the south, we have all the turmoil or the violence at our borders. Iraq, Syria, bordering a NATO ally, Turkey, in North Africa, close to Italy, the southern Europe. And terrorist attacks, hybrid warfare, close to us and in our streets. All of this has really made the security environment which we are faced with so much more challenging and in many ways more dangerous. And therefore NATO has to respond. And that's, we have started that adaptation, but we have to make new important decisions at the summit in Warsaw, making sure that NATO changes, NATO adapts when the world around us is changing. And that is what we're going to do at Warsaw.
And how have you been handling the pressures that Poland brings to the table? They're obviously quite bullish, they're quite hawkish, they want perhaps even nuclear weapons stationed on behalf of the NATO alliance there. And then on the other hand, NATO is an alliance of democracies, but there's been serious questions about the direction that Poland is traveling with. One person before the event today wanted me to ask, did you even consider taking the summit away from Warsaw? So there's tensions in two directions there, and I wanted to know how that played on your mind.
First of all, I'm 100% certain that we will reach consensus on how to adapt the alliance, and that Poland, all the other allies, will agree when we meet in Warsaw in a few weeks. Second, last week I visited Berlin, but I also visited Warsaw. And I really feel that we are now developing a common understanding, both when it comes to the analysis, to understand the challenges we are faced with, but more important also how to respond. And for NATO, this is about having some more military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, including with forces in Poland and the Baltic countries. But it's also about that we will do what we can to avoid a new Cold War. We don't seek confrontation with Russia. Actually, we continue to strive for a more cooperative and constructive relationship with Russia. That was the message that was the message in Warsaw, and that was the message in Berlin. Meaning that this idea that we are so divided and that we disagree so much, I think it's very exaggerated. We are actually now in the process of uniting and reaching a common approach based on this message of a dual-track approach to Russia, which is about strength, deterrence, defense, but also based on that, reaching out for political dialogue with Russia, because we believe that in the long run, we just have to understand that Russia is our biggest neighbor. We have to relate to Russia, and we have to work with Russia, and that's in a way the political basis for what we are addressing in Warsaw.
Mm-hmm. So, even if you get on the same page on Russia, are you putting enough into it? I mean, it's also been put to me that NATO at some level is sleepwalking on this. How can one battalion, for example, cover itself against a whole division from Russia? You know, are we just crossing our fingers in the Baltics, or are you really ready?
So what I just have to explain a bit what we are trying or aiming at doing, and it's exactly as you said. What we are now aiming at is to have enhanced forward presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and we are discussing to have a battalion in each of the 3 Baltic countries and in Poland. This will be a multinational battalion. It will be a reinforced battalion, and it will send a very clear signal, because when you have a multinational NATO presence in the 3 Baltic countries and in Poland, it sends a signal that an attack on one of the Baltic countries or in Poland will be an attack on the whole alliance. So that's about assurance, it's about deterrence, it's about sending the message that NATO, we stand together. An attack on one ally would be an attack on the whole alliance. But the forward presence of a battalion in each of the 3 Baltic countries is not the only answer. We have to understand that that's just one element of many building blocks in our response. More forward presence is one element. Enhanced and increased readiness and preparedness of our forces is another important element. Enabling us to deploy forces quickly if needed, to reinforce if needed. So we have tripled the size of the NATO response force. Now it's 40,000 troops. And as part of that, we have established a very high joint readiness force, which can deploy within, the lead elements can deploy within hours.
So it's enough?
Yeah, so no, but I mean, if there is a need, we can redeploy, we can reinforce if needed. To send an even stronger signal about deterrence, the idea to have enhanced forward presence, enhanced ability to reinforce if needed, is not to fight the war, but it's to prevent the war. Strong defense is not because we want to fight war, but it's because we want to send such a clear signal at any time that any adversary understands that there's no way you can attack a NATO country, because we have the response from the whole alliance. And add to that, that we will also invest more in infrastructure, in pre-positioning, in supplies of supplies and equipment, and all of this enable us to send this clear signal that NATO is there to protect all allies against any threats, and then prevent the conflict.
That's a very opportune moment to turn to the southern flank, as it were, because you no longer have the luxury of just dealing with an eastern flank. You've got a southern issue to deal with as well. So I'm wondering, is NATO making a pivot to the Mediterranean? Just tell us how you're making the pivot to the Mediterranean, because you have a migration crisis where literally there are hundreds of people drowning every month. You've got ships in operation down there. You have a people smuggling operation in Africa that is partly organized by ISIS, that channels funds into ISIS, that's delivering political crisis onto the doorstep in Europe. So how is NATO going to get more involved in the Mediterranean?
So you already said it. We don't have the luxury of choosing between either addressing the challenges we see to the east or the threats and the challenges we see to the south. We have to do both at the same time. And that's exactly what we are doing. That's the reason why we are enhancing our military presence in the east, but that's also the reason why we are addressing the challenges to the south in many different ways. Because we speak about different types of challenges and different situations in different countries. We can start with Afghanistan, which in one way is also part of the south. Afghanistan is our biggest military operation ever. We will continue to support the Afghans. Many of the refugees and migrants are coming from Afghanistan, and we will continue to fight international terrorism by supporting the Afghan government. Then we have started to train Iraqi officers. And we are working with countries like Jordan, Tunisia, based on the idea that NATO has to be prepared to deploy large number of combat forces in military operations also in the future. But I believe that we should be as much focused or even more focused on what can we do to create stability or project stability, not by deploying our own forces in combat operations, but by training local forces to enable them to stabilize their own countries and to fight ISIL themselves.
Okay, so I want to bring in Barbara Sirk, who covers NATO and defense for Politico. So if we can get a microphone to Barbara, because that brings us to Libya, where there isn't really a government that you can train in order to cover that, and which is a real pinch point in this migration issue. So Barbara, I think you have a question on that.
Yes, I would like to ask you, it would actually combine the mission that you were talking about before, that you are cooperating with the Sophia mission of the European Union. And I was wondering, is there a point, the way you see it, where NATO has to join the European Union in the mission in some sort of a military capacity and go into Libyan territorial waters, possibly to the coast, to get that done? In other words, not just to fight smugglers, but to take on ISIS if it has to.
I think it's important to underline that we are ready, we stand ready to help the new government of national accord in Libya, but we will only do that if so requested, and we will only do that as part of a broader UN effort. We don't have any plans to go into any kind of combat operations or combat presence, either on land in Libya or in Libya's territorial waters. What we are discussing is how can we both provide support to the new government, if they so request. We are focusing on how can we do the institution building. And we are also discussing with the European Union what NATO can do to support their Operation Sophia. No decisions has been taken. NATO has capabilities. We have resources which I think can be useful for the European Union.
But shouldn't they be deployed? Shouldn't you push it? I mean, if there are hundreds of people drowning every month, we can't just wait around and say they're there.
But then we speak about many different things now, because she asked me about not mainly, I think, the migrant or the refugee crisis, but she asked me about whether we will move into Libya and into Libyan territorial waters. And my answer to that is that, first of all, we will not do anything without being requested by the Libyan government. Be it into territorial waters or on land Libya. Second, we are not aiming at any kind of military combat presence in Libya. That's not on the agenda. What we are looking into is the possibility of doing what we call institution building. and institution building in Libya. And that sounds a bit bureaucratic, but it is extremely important. Because if the international community, maybe others than NATO, starts to train local Libyan forces, it is extremely important that those forces can can work or be part of a well-organized army and defense structure, and not end up in as new forces to a local militia. So therefore, to help the new Libyan government with building a defense ministry, command structures, defense planning, is extremely important if you are able to, if our aim, and since our aim is to make it possible for the Libyans themselves to take care of stability, security in their own country, supported by us, but done by them. So my answer is that we don't have any plans in what I say going in there with any kind of combat operations. What we are discussing is then whether we shall do more to support the European Union. We have done so successfully in the Aegean Sea. The big difference between the Aegean Sea and the rest of the Mediterranean is that, of course, in the Aegean Sea you have EU on one side, Greece, but NATO on both sides, Greece and Turkey. So NATO was very good, a good platform for enhancing cooperation between Turkey and Greece, Turkey and the European Union. That's not the case when you look at North Africa and Southern Europe.
But so this is precisely what I wanted to, what my question was. If Operation Sophia does go into the 5th stage, let's say that the government in Tripoli invites the EU force, isn't NATO the best, has the best position to simply just move in with the operation?
I'll be very careful in speculating too much, because I think that the important thing now is that we are assessing the different alternatives in a careful way, in a prudent way, and that we discuss with the European Union, with UN, and of course with the Libyan government, what's the best approach. We stand ready to help. We stand ready to assist. We have some capabilities, but I'm very, very focused on that we do this in a way which is accepted by the broader international community, and of course also accepted by the Libyan government. So if I started now to speculate on all different possible roles of NATO, I think it can only create more uncertainty and therefore actually reduce the possibilities to find a good way to approach the very delicate and sensitive situation in Libya.
Just one last question on this. I don't want to monopolize the microphone, but I will for a little bit. When you say that you are talking about different possibilities and you're assessing the situation and there's reconnaissance missions to the Libyan coast, is there in these meetings, is there a sense of just how close ISIS has come in the past 2 years only to the shores of Europe?
But again, it may be that I misunderstand you, but what I was talking about was to support efforts in the high seas.
Sure.
So that's something different. Second, we have a clear decision by NATO heads of state and government from our summit in 2014 to stand ready to help a new government in Libya. Now we have that new government with the government of national accord. I spoke with Prime Minister Sarraj some weeks ago. We agreed that he should send a team of experts to Brussels, to NATO, and sit down with our people and find out what can we help, and how can we help in the best possible way. And the main focus, as I said, is to build institutions, because they desperately need to have stronger institutions to be able to have the framework for building a coast guard, for building a national army, for building all the other stuff they need. And again, since if I start to mention all different possible roles that NATO may possibly have, I think I just would add to confusion, add to uncertainty, and that's the last thing this country and this process needs. So I will just limit myself to say that we stand ready. We are in dialogue with the European Union, dialogue with the Sarraj government, and then depending on what they ask us for, what they want us to do, we will of course consider and see what we can do to help them.
Thank you
That
very much.
highlights your dilemma a little bit, doesn't it? Where it's in this world of hybrid warfare, it's getting harder and harder to know where NATO starts and where NATO ends. And you're hamstrung a little bit by needing to, act on requests rather than having your own free mandate.
For me, that's not a big problem. For me, the important thing is that NATO provides deterrence, defense, collective defense for all NATO allies, and we do that. And we do that stronger and better than just a couple of years ago, because the world has become more dangerous. So we have to remember that what we have done since 2014 is the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War. To triple the size of the NATO response force is not a small thing, it's a big thing. To establish 8 small headquarters in the eastern part of the alliance is not a small thing, it's a big thing. And to have forward presence of NATO forces in the eastern part of the alliance is not a small thing, it's a big thing. And then to invest in pre-positioning, infrastructure, airfield, harbors and so on, to enable reinforcement and to have more exercises than before, all of that is a very, very strong response to the challenges we see also to our collective, to our shared security. Add to that we are now also then starting to do more when it comes to projecting stability without deploying combat forces by training, helping countries in the south. We do that large scale in Afghanistan. We have ended our combat operation. What we do in Afghanistan now is to train the Afghans, enabling the Afghans to take care of their own security. And we work with Jordan, as I said, Tunisia. We help them with special operation forces and other capabilities, because we strongly believe that they have to be able to keep their own country stable and to stabilize their own country.
Just a couple of final quick questions before we bring in the audience. Montenegro is obviously a success for you.
I don't know if this is very successful, but it's okay.
Can everyone hear? That's the main thing. Yes, excellent. So Montenegro, to join, set to join as the next member of NATO. Let's just say Russia didn't seem very happy about that progress last week. What do you expect Russia to do now? Do you think they'll try and disrupt the ratification process?
It is an absolute and fundamental principle, which also Russia has subscribed to, for instance, in the Helsinki Final Act and in many other documents, that every sovereign nation has the right to decide its own path. And that's, of course, also the case for Montenegro. And Montenegro has decided that they want to join NATO. And then it is a decision by the 28 present members of NATO whether they would like to welcome Montenegro or not. And we have decided that we would like to welcome Montenegro. And no one else, no one outside that group of the applicant country and the member countries of NATO has the right to intervene or try to, in a way, deny or to veto such a process. Because it is a decision by the applicant country and the 28 allies, and only them, to decide whether a new country shall join the alliance. I've seen that Russia dislikes this, but I just remind them of the fact that they have also subscribed to the principle of the sovereign right of every nation to decide what kind of security arrangements it wants to be part of, and Montenegro has decided that it wants to become a member of NATO.
Now, a very quick stop on the internal bureaucracy at NATO. It's almost time for you to appoint a new Deputy Secretary General. Can you tell us a little bit about who's on the shortlist and whether you expect that to happen before the Warsaw Summit, or maybe at the Warsaw Summit?
No, I will not tell you anything about that. Thank you.
I've got Rose Gottmola, Martin Erdmann, and Yuri Luke on the list. So keep an eye out for those names, folks. And now finally, well, it's NATO related, but it's not NATO specific. And it's on the question of why men should be feminists. And you have, you've got a long track record on these issues. And I will say that I think, and I've said it before, that the stages of this town are very male heavy. We're doing it again tonight with 2 men on the stage. And I think if you look through the list of the top positions in NATO, you'd have to search for a very long time to find someone other than Oana Longescu, who's sitting here in the front row, who's the NATO spokesperson, to find a non-male in all of those structures. And I hear that you met up with fellow pro-feminist Justin Trudeau in Davos. So I wondered, did you talk about that? Is there any hope of progress? And what can you do to contribute to that progress to get more women up into public debates in NATO and in Brussels?
Yeah. So first of all, we talked about the importance of feminism and equal rights for men and women, and including how to address that in the world of army and defense and so on. And it's a big challenge in general, but in particular when it comes to defense sector and everything related to that, and of course NATO. Because mostly men has been part of that world and defense institutions up to now. One of the things I did when I was Prime Minister was to introduce conscription not only for men but also for women, and that has proved.
That's one way to bring about equality.
That's one way. So if you are some Norwegians are against conscription, but in favor of conscription for men and women. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of being. That at least I think that has been one way of increasing the number of women being part of the armed forces, and that lays the ground for a more also more women in the top ranks after a while. No, I am focused on how can I promote more women in the NATO alliance in general. We have some excellent defense ministers who are women, yep. And I think they are good examples of that women can be top leaders in also this male world. And this has been an issue which I have addressed during my whole political life, because my first public position was to share the Norwegian Royal Commission of the role of men in a society with equal rights between men and women. And that was about how we can have more equal rights and how men can contribute to that. So I feel a responsibility for that.
Thank you for those comments. I think it's time that we bring all of you into the discussion. I've also noted some questions down from Twitter. So who would like to go first? I've got Alice here, and then the gentleman in the jacket. We'll bring a mic over. They're not in the sides of the chairs at the moment. And if you can just explain who, if anyone, you're representing when you ask your question.
Hello, my name is Jens Stoltenberg. I'm an energy and climate blogger. Last year, ahead of the UN Climate Summit in Paris, NATO has stated that climate change poses significant threat multipliers. And I was wondering, could you tell us what NATO is doing to address this, and how to, amid all the other crises, to keep the climate security threat on the agenda? Thank you.
First of all, I think it's very important to underline what you just said, and that is that climate change is also a security threat, because it can really change also the conditions for where people can live. It can create new migrant and refugee crises, and scarce resources, water, can fuel new conflicts. So climate change is also about preventing conflicts and creating more stability and prosperity, which is good for peace and stability. Second, NATO is addressing how we can also address how we can contribute. NATO is, of course, not the first responder to climate change. We are a military alliance. But partly everything that can make also military vehicles, military equipment more energy efficient will be good both for the environment but also for the sustainability of the armed forces. So energy efficiency, less energy dependence of the armed forces is good for both the armed forces as armed forces and good for the environment. And that's actually the thing we can do as an alliance. We are also sharing this information with allies, trying to increase their focus and understanding of this. But of course, the most important things that can be done with climate change is more related to energy, to Ministry of Environment, to other areas than defense.
Thank you. Yes, Brooke Stigner, Jane's Defense Weekly. I have a question about the non-Cold War situation we're in. It's pretty clear Russia has absolutely no interest right now in partnership with NATO. It doesn't look to have that for a while. And Cold War-like aggression seems to be emerging from the other end of Europe. Officials in East Europe, when I speak to them, Poland especially, off record, they say, you bet we're in a pre-Cold War-like situation. Think tank people tell me this, and even some NATO officials off record. My question to you, if you want the public to support more defense spending and more quickly, wouldn't it make more sense to be a little bit more frank about the subject, in other words? I know you don't want to say we're in a Cold War situation, but perhaps some more alarm bells need to be rung with the public. Thank you.
First of all, I think it's very important to be frank, and second, I think it's also important to be nuanced and not to paint everything in black and white, because that's not always the truth. Second, I think at least so far, but we have a long way to go. But so far, we have been quite successful when it comes to defense spending, because 1 year after we made the pledge to stop the cuts, we were able to stop the cuts. If you look at European NATO allies in total, the picture is very mixed, but at least it's better than it was a year ago. And I also underline that we have a very, very long way to go before we are where we should be, but that's something we must address in the coming years. The reason why I'm not saying that we are in a Cold War is that I don't believe we are in a Cold War, for many reasons. Partly because the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. And Russia is something very different than the Soviet Union. And the Warsaw Pact, most of the countries that were members of the Warsaw Pact, actually all of the countries that were members of the Warsaw Pact, except for Russia, are now members of NATO. And the ideological global rivalry we had between the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, and the West, NATO, is not what we see today. But we see a more assertive Russia, and we see a Russia which has invested heavily in military capabilities and which has been willing to use them against Ukraine. And that's the reason why we are adapting. That's the reason why we are implementing the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War. But that's also the reason why we continue to underline that we don't see confrontation with Russia. We actually continue to strive for more cooperative and constructive relationship with Russia. Because Russia is going to be there. Russia is our biggest neighbor. There's no way we can or should try to isolate Russia. But we have to find ways to work with them. And add to that Russia is member of the UN Security Council. Russia is taking part in many processes which are important for NATO, like for instance, and sometimes Russia also plays a constructive role, like they for instance did when it comes to as regarding the Iran nuclear deal or the destruction of chemical weapons in Syria. So I think it is important to understand this bit complex and complicated picture. And it's only when you address this in a complex and complicated way that you are frank and honest. Because to say that this is very easy and this is very straightforward, that is not the truth, and then I should never say that.
Okay, we've got this gentleman in the check shirt, and if Terry Schultz is in the room, I know she had a question, and she gets the last one. So please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Vadim. I'm from East of Europe, and we very much liked your presence and your visit at the Vesel in Romania. And talking about specifically this area, about Black Sea, the president of Turkey said we should avoid the Black Sea to become a Russian lake. Russian officials said we should avoid Black Sea to become a NATO lake. What do you think will be the position of NATO to maintain a sustainable defense policy and security policy in Black Sea? Thank you.
The Black Sea is not a lake, so the Black Sea should be a peaceful sea where we have cooperation between the countries bordering or the littoral countries. But what we have seen is, of course, that after the Russian annexation of Crimea, we have seen a significant military build-up in Crimea, and Russia is also deploying and developing what is called A2AD or anti-access area denial capabilities there. And therefore NATO has increased its military presence in the Black Sea, And I know that NATO allies in the Black Sea region, also Turkey, Romania and Bulgaria, they are also now discussing how we can further increase our presence in the Black Sea and the Black Sea region. And again, I visited also Ankara and Bucharest recently, and these were some of the issues we discussed, how we can increase our military presence. But again, the message is the same. We have to be strong, we have to be firm, we have to be predictable, not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict, and not to isolate Russia, but to provide a necessary basis for a political engagement with Russia, and that's also the case for the Black Sea.
Okay, the cocktails are in sight. Terry, one last quick question. Terry's at the very back, if there's no microphone back there.
How do you see the situation in Afghanistan? They're making progress in small ways, but the Taliban are staging ever more, aggressive assaults on Afghan troops, and we just don't talk about it like we used to. I used to raise it at every news conference, and I don't anymore. And today, it just really brought home for me that things aren't settled there by any means. Thanks. And R.I.P. David Gilkey.
First, I would like to express my condolences and also express my sympathy to those who have lost their loved ones and friends and colleagues in Afghanistan. And second, I would like to underline how important it is that journalists are continuing to report from what's happening in Afghanistan. And I agree with you that it is a paradox that there is less attention to what's going on in Afghanistan now. But the situation is still very difficult. There are still many people who suffer, and there is still a very unstable and unsafe situation. And the NATO is still present with around 12,000 troops. You know, I know, we know that we don't have any guarantees in Afghanistan, and we have to expect more violence, more instability, also in the coming months. But I can not see any alternative to continue to try to help the Afghans take full responsibility and being able to manage security in their own country. And I also feel very strongly, as I've already stated, that what we have done in Afghanistan is the right approach, and that is that we have ended the NATO combat mission, but we continue to try to enable the Afghans to stabilize their own country. We have a big training mission there, and we have decided to continue to train them, to assist them and advise them, and we have also decided to continue to provide financial support for the Afghan army and security forces. Not because we believe that in 1 or 2 or 3 years Afghanistan will be like an average European democratic society, but because we believe that's the only way to at least be able to avoid that Afghanistan again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists and a place where Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations can operate freely. So there is no easy way, there are no only nice alternatives in Afghanistan, but to continue to support the Afghan is the best alternative among many.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Stoltenberg. It's an honor that you've joined us. I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Raytheon, and I want to remind you that on your way out to the cocktails, we also have evaluation forms, and we're an audience-driven organization at Politico, so we really want your feedback on what we have been doing right, what we could have done better, and who you'd like to have speak at future cocktails and playbook breakfasts. Thank you very much for joining.